Aunt Marge's big mistake. Harry went down to breakfast the next morning to find the three Dursleys already sitting around the kitchen table. They were watching a brand new television show, Welcome Home for the Summer presents for Dudley, who had been complaining loudly that there were long walks between the fridge and the televisions in the living room. Dudley had spent most of his summer in the kitchen, his piggy little eyes fixed on the screen, and his five chins wobbling as he ate continually. Harry sat down between Dudley and Uncle Vernon on a large, beefy man with very little neck and a lot of mustache. Far from wishing Happy a Harry birthday, none of the Dursleys made any sign that they even noticed Harry enter the room. But Harry was far too used to this to care. He helped himself to a piece of toast and looked over at the reporter on the television, who was halfway through the report on an escaped convict. The public is warned that Black is armed and extremely dangerous. A special hotline has been set up. If any sightings of Black should be reported immediately. No need to tell us he's no good, snorted Uncle Vernon, staring at the top of the newspaper at the prisoner. Look at the state of him, filthy laborer. Look at his hair. He shot a nasty look sideways at Harry, whose untidy hair had always been the source of great annoyance of Uncle Vernon. Compared to a man on the television, however, whose gaunt face was surrounded by matted elbow-length tangle, Harry felt very well groomed indeed. The reporter had reappeared. The Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries will announce today. Hang on, barked Uncle Vernon, staring furiously at the reporter. You didn't tell us there were maniacs who escaped from. Well, it used. What use is that? Lunatics could be coming up the street right now. Aunt Petunia, who was bony and horse-faced, whipped around and peered intently out of the kitchen window. Harry knew Aunt Petunia would simply love to be the one to call the hotline number. She was the nosiest woman in the world and spent most of her life spying on the boring, law-abiding neighbors. When will they learn? Said Uncle Vernon, pounding the table with his large purple fist. That hanging's the only way to deal with these people. Very true, said Aunt Petunia, who was still squinting into the door's runner beans. Uncle Vernon drained the teacup, glanced at his watch, and added, Up, I'd better be off in a minute, Petunia. Marge's train gets here at 10. Harry, whose thoughts had been upstairs with the broomstick's servicing kit, was now brought back to earth with an unpleasant bump. Aunt Marge? He blurted out. She's coming here, is she? Aunt Marge was Uncle Vernon's sister, even though she was not blood relative of Harry's, whose mother had been Aunt Petunia's sister. He had been forced to call her aunt all his life. Aunt Marge lived in the country in a house with a large garden, where she bred bulldogs, and she didn't often stay at Privet Drive because she couldn't bear to leave her precious little dogs. And each of her visits were stood out horribly, vividly in Harry's mind. At Dudley's 5th birthday party, Aunt Marge had whacked Harry around with the shins with her walking stick to stop him from beating Dudley at musical statues. A few years later, she had turned up at Christmas with a computerized robot for Dudley and a box of dog biscuits for Harry. On the last visit, the year before Harry started Hogwarts, Harry had accidentally trodden on the tail of her favorite dog, Ripper, and chased Harry out of the garden and up a tree. Aunt Petunia had refused to call him off until past midnight. The memory of this incident still brought tears of laughter to Dudley's eyes. Marge will be here for a week, Uncle Vernon snarled. And while we're on the subject, he pointed his fat finger threateningly at Harry, we need to get a few things straight before I go collect her. Dudley smirked and withdrew his gaze from the television. Watching Harry being bullied by Uncle Vernon was Dudley's favorite form of entertainment. "Firstly," growled Uncle Vernon, "you'll keep a civil tongue your head in your head when you're talking to Marge." "All right," said Harry bitterly. "If she does what she's talking to me, what if she does when she's talking to me?" "Secondly," said Uncle Vernon, acting as though he had not heard Harry's reply, "as Marge doesn't know anything about your abnormality, I don't want any funny stuff while she's here. You'd better behave yourself. Get me? Got me?" "I will if she does," said Harry through his gritted teeth. "And thirdly," said Uncle Vernon, this mean little eyes now dies on his great purple face, "we've told Marge you've attended St. Brutus Secure Center for the Incurably Criminal Boys." "What?" Harry yelled. "And you'll be sticking to that story, boy, or there'll be trouble," said Fat Uncle Vernon. Oh, Harry sat there, white-faced and furious, staring at Uncle Vernon, hardly able to believe it. Aunt Marge coming for a week-long visit. It was the worst birthday present the Dursleys had ever given him, including the pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks. "Well, Petunia," said Uncle Vernon, getting heavily to his feet, "I'll be off to the stations then. Want to come along for the ride, Dudlers?" "No," said Dudley, whose attention had now returned to the television, and Uncle Vernon had finished threatening Harry. "Dudley's got to make himself smart for his auntie," said Aunt Petunia, smoothing Dudley's thick blonde hair. "Mummy's bought him a new lovely bow tie." Uncle Vernon clapped Dudley on the porky shoulder. "See you in a bit, then," he said as he left the kitchen. Harry, who had been sitting in the kind, horrified trance, had sudden idea. Abandoning his toast, he got up quickly to his feet and followed Uncle Vernon to the front door. Uncle Vernon was pulling into the car on his car coat. "I'm not talking to you," he snarled as he turned around to Harry, watching him. "Like I wanted to come. I'm not taking you," he said. "Like I wanted to come," said Harry coldly. "I want to ask you something." Uncle Vernon eyed him suspiciously. "Third years at Hogwarts at my school are allowed to visit the village sometimes," said Harry. "So?" snapped Uncle Vernon, taking his car keys from the hook next to the door. "I need you to sign the permission form," said Harry in a rush. "And why would I do that?" sneered Uncle Vernon. "Well," said Harry, choosing his words carefully, "it'll be hard work pretending to Aunt Marge that I go to some St. What's-it, St. Bruno Secure for Incurably Criminal Boys," bellowed Uncle Vernon. And Harry was pleased to hear the definite note of panic in Uncle Vernon's voice. "Exactly," said Harry, looking calmly up into Uncle Vernon's large purple face. "It's a lot to remember. I'll have to make it sound convincing, won't I? And if I accidentally let something slip—" "You'll get a stuffing knocked out of you, won't you?" roared Uncle Vernon, advancing on Harry with his fist raised. But Harry stood his ground. "Knocking the stuffing on me won't make Aunt Marge forget what I could tell her," he said grimly. Uncle Vernon stopped, his fist still raised, his face as ugly and puce. "But if you sign this permission form," Harry went on quickly, "I'll swear I'll remember where I'm supposed to be at school, and I'll act like a mug, like a normal in everything." Harry could see that Uncle Vernon was thinking this over, even if his teeth were bared and his veins were throbbing in his temple. "Right," he snapped finally. "I shall monitor your behavior carefully during Marge's visit. If at the end of it you have toed the line and kept the story, I'll sign your ruddy form." He wheeled around, pulled open the front door, and slammed it as hard as the little panes of the glass fell out. Harry didn't return into the kitchen. He went back upstairs to his bedroom. He was going to act like a real muggle. He'd better start now, Slowly and sadly he gathered up all his presents and his birthday cards and hid them under the loose floorboard with his homework. Then he went to Hedwig's cage. Errol seemed to be having recovered. He and Hedwig were both asleep, heads under their wings. Harry sighed and poked them both awake. Hedwig, he said gloomily, you're going to have to clear off for a week and go with Errol. Ron will look after you. I'll write him a note explaining, and don't look at me like that. Hedwig's large animal eyes were reproachful. It's not my fault. It's the only way I'll be allowed to go to Hogsmeade with Ron and Hermione. 10 minutes later, Errol Hedwig, who had a note bound to her leg, soared out the window, out of sight. Harry, now feeling thoroughly miserable, put the empty cage away inside the wardrobe. But Harry didn't have long to brood. In next to no time, Aunt Petunia was shrieking up the stairs for Harry to come down and get ready to welcome their guests. Do something about your hair, Aunt Petunia snapped as she reached the hall. Harry couldn't see the point of making the hair look better. Aunt Marge loved criticizing him, so the untidier he looked, the happier she would be. All too soon there was a crunch of gravel outside. Uncle Vernon's car pulled back into the driveway, and then a chunk of the car door and the footprints in the garden path. Get the door! Aunt Petunia hissed at Harry. A feeling of great gloom in his stomach, Harry pulled the door open. In the threshold stood Aunt Marge. Ooh, she was very, very like Uncle Vernon, large, beefy, purple-faced, and even had a mustache, though not a bushy one as his. In one hand she held an enormous suitcase, and tucked under her was another old-fashioned, evil-tempered bulldog. "Where's my dudders?" roared Aunt Marge. "Where's my Neffy Pooh?" Dudley came waddling down the hall, and his blond hair plastered flat to his fat head, a bow tie just visible under his many chins. Aunt Marge thrust the suitcase into Harry's stomach, knocking the wind out of him, seized Dudley in a tight, one-armed hug, and planted a large kiss on his cheek. Harry knew perfectly well that Dudley only put up with Aunt Marge's hugs because he was well paid for it. Sure enough, when they broke apart, Dudley had a crisp 20-pound note clutched to his fat fist. "Petunia!" shouted Aunt Marge, striding past Harry as though he was a hat stand. Aunt Marge and Aunt Petunia kissed, or rather, Aunt Marge bumped her large jaw against Aunt Petunia's bony cheekbone. Uncle Vernon now came in, smiling jovially as he shut the door. "Tea, Marge?" he said. "Oh, and what will Ripper take?" "Ripper can have some tea out of my saucer," said Aunt Marge, as they all trooped into the kitchen, leaving Harry alone in the hall with a suitcase. But Harry wasn't complaining. Any excuse not to be with Aunt Marge was fine by him. So he began to heave the suitcase up the stairs, taking as long as he possibly could. By the time he got back to the kitchen, Aunt March had been supplied with tea and fruit cake. Ripper was lapping noisily out of the corner. Harry saw Aunt Petunia wince slightly as specks of tea and drool flecked on the kitchen floor, and Aunt Petunia hated animals. "Who's looking after the other dogs, Marge?" Uncle Vernon asked. "Oh, I've got Colonel Fubster managing them," boomed Aunt Marge. "He's retired now. Good for him to have something to do, but I couldn't leave poor old Ripper. He pines if he's away from me." Ripper began to growl again as Harry sat down. This directed Aunt Marge's attention to Harry for the very first time. "So," she barked, "still here, are you?" "Yes," said Harry. "Don't you say yes in that ungrateful tone," Aunt Marge growled. "I'm darn good of Vernon and Petunia to keep you. Wouldn't have done it myself. You'd have to gone straight to the orphanage if you'd been dumped in my doorstep." Harry was bursting to say he'd rather live in an orphanage than with the Dursleys, but the thought of Hogsmeade made him stop. He forced his face into a painful smile. Don't you smirk at me, boomed Aunt Marge. I can see you haven't improved since I saw you last. I hope that school would knock some manners into you. She took a large gulp of tea, wiped her mustache, and said, Where is it that you sent him again, Vernon? St. Brutus, said Uncle Vernon promptly. It's a first-rate institution for hopeless cases. I see, said Aunt Madge. Do they use a cane at St. Brutus? Boys, she barked across the table. Uncle Vernon nodded curtly behind Aunt Marge's back. Yes, said Harry. Then, feeling that he might as well do the thing properly, he added, all the time. Excellent, said Aunt Marge. I won't have this namby-pamby, wishy-washy nonsense about not hitting people who deserve it. I think a good thrashing is what is needed by 99 cases out of 100. Have you been beaten often? Oh, yeah, said Harry, loads of times. Aunt Marge narrowed her eyes. I still don't like your tone, boy. If you can speak of your beatings in a casual way, clearly they aren't hitting you hard enough. Petunia, I'd write if I were you to make clear that you approve of using extreme force in this boy's case. Perhaps Uncle Vernon was worried that Harry might forget the bargain. In any case, he changed the subject abruptly. Heard of any news this morning, Marge? What about the escaped prisoner, eh? As Marge started to make herself at home, Harry caught himself thinking almost longingly of life of life at number 4 without her. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia usually encouraged Harry to stay out of their way, which Harry was only too happy to do. Aunt Marge, on the other hand, wanted Harry under her eye at all times, so that she could boom her suggestions out for improvements. She delighted in comparing Harry with Dudley and took huge pleasure in buying Dudley expensive gifts while glaring at Harry as though daring him to ask why he hadn't got a present too. She also kept throwing out dark hints about what made Harry such an unsatisfactory person. You mustn't blame yourself for the ways turn out, Vernon, she said over lunch the third day. If something rotten is on the inside, there's nothing anyone can do about it. Harry tried to concentrate on his food, but his hands shook. His face was starting to burn with anger. Remember the form, he told himself. Remember, think about Hogsmeade. Don't say anything. Don't rise. Aunt Marge reached for her glass of wine. It's one of the basic rules of breeding, she said. You see it all the time in dogs. If there's something wrong with the dog, there'll be something wrong with the pup. The mother, there'll be something wrong with the pup. At that moment, the wine glass Aunt Marge was holding exploded in her hand. Shards of glass flew in every direction. Aunt Marge sputtered and blinked, her great ruddy face dripping. Marge! Squealed Aunt Petunia. Marge, are you all right? No, not to worry, grunted Marge, mopping her face with her napkin. Must have squeezed it too hard. Did the same thing at Colonel Fubster's the other day. No need to fuss, Petunia. I have a firm grip. But Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon were both looking at Harry suspiciously, so he decided he better skip dessert and escape from the table as fast as he could. Outside the hall, he leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. It had been a long time since he'd lost control of making something explode. He couldn't afford to have it happen again. The Hogsmeade form wasn't the only thing at stake. If he carried on like that, he'd be in trouble with the Ministry of Magic. Harry was still an underage wizard, and it was forbidden for wizard law to make magic outside of school. His record wasn't exactly clean either. Only last summer he'd gotten an official warning that he'd stated quite clearly that Ministry got wind of any more magic on Privet Drive, Harry would face expulsion from Hogwarts. He heard the Dursleys leaving the table and hurried upstairs out of the way. Harry got through the next 3 days, forcing himself to think about the handbook of do-it-yourself broom's care whenever Aunt Marge started on him. This worked quite well, though it seemed to give him a glazed look because Aunt Marge started voicing her opinion that he was mentally abnormal. At last, at long last, the final evening of Marge's stay arrived. Aunt Petunia cooked a fancy dinner. Uncle Vernon uncorked several bottles of wine, and all the way through the soup and the salmon, without a single mention of Harry's faults, during the lemon meringue pie, Uncle Vernon, then all with a long talk about the grunnings and drill makings of his company, Aunt Petunia made coffee, and Uncle Vernon brought a new bottle of brandy. "Can I tempt you, Marge?" Aunt Marge had already had quite a lot of wine. Her huge face was really red. "Oh, just a small one, then," she chuckled. "A bit more than that. Oh, a little bit more. Oh, that's the ticker." Dudley was eating the fourth slice of pie. Aunt Petunia was sipping coffee with her little finger sticking out. Harry really wanted to disappear into his bedroom, but he met Uncle Vernon's angry little eyes and knew he would have to sit it out. "Ah," said Marge, smacking her lips and putting the empty brandy glass back down. "Excellent, Nosh, Petunia. It's not normally just fry up for me in one evening. 12 dogs to look after." She burped richly and patted her great tweed stomach. "Pardon me, I do like to see a healthy sized boy," she went on, winking at Dudley. "You'll be a proper sized man, Dudders, like your father. Yes, you'll have a spot more brandy, Vernon?" "Not with this one here." She jerked her head over to Harry, who felt his stomach clench. The handbook, he thought quickly. "This one's got a mean, runty look about him. You get that with the dogs. I had Connor Fobster drowned the last year. A ratty little thing it was, weak, underlin, unbred, underbred." Harry was trying to remember page 12 of his book, A Charm to Cure Reluctant Reverers. "It'll come down to blood. I say it on the other day. About Bad blood will always will out. Now, I'm saying nothing against your family, Petunia." She patted Petunia's bony hand with her shovel-sized one. "But your sister was a bad egg. They turn up to the families," and she ran off with Wastrel, "and here's the result right here in front of us." Harry, staring at his plate with a funny ringing in his ear, grasped your broom firmly by the tail, he thought. Then he couldn't remember what came next. Aunt Marge's voice seemed to be boring into him like Uncle Vernon's drills. "This Potter," Aunt Marge said loudly, seizing the brandy bottle and splashing more into her glass over the tablecloth. "You never told me what he did." Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia were looking extremely tense now. Dudley even looked up from his pie and gaped at his parents. He he didn't work," said Uncle Vernon, with half a glance at Harry. "Unemployed." "Oh, as I expected," said Aunt Marge, taking a huge swig of brandy, wiping her chin with her sleeve. "No account good for nothing, lazy scrounger who—" "He was not," said Harry suddenly. The table went very quiet. Harry was shaking all over. He had never been so angry in his life. "More brandy?" yelled Uncle Vernon, who had gone very white. He emptied the bottle into Aunt Marge's glass. "You boy!" he snarled at Harry. "Go to bed. Go on." "No, Vernon," hiccuped Marge, holding the hand, tiny bloodshot eyes fixed on Harry. "Go on, boy. Go on. Proud of your parents, are you? They go and get themselves killed in a car crash. Drunk, I expect." "They did not die in a car crash," said Harry, who found himself on his feet. "They died in a car crash, you nearly little liar, and left you to be a burden on these decent, hard-working relatives," screamed Aunt Marge, swelling with fury. "You are an insolent, ungrateful little—" But Marge suddenly stopped speaking. For a moment it looked as though the words had failed her. She seemed to be swelling up with inexpressible anger. But the swelling didn't stop. Her great red face started to expand. Her tiny eyes bulged. Her mouth stretched too tightly for speech. Next second, several buttons just burst off her tweed jacket and pinged off the walls. She was inflating like a monstrous balloon. Her stomach was bursting free of her tweed waistband. Each fingers were blowing up like salami. "Marge!" yelled Uncle Vernon and Petunia together. Aunt Marge's whole body began to rise off the chair towards the ceiling. She was entirely round now, like a vast life buoy with piggy little eyes, and her hands and feet stuck out weirdly as she drifted up into the air, making epileptic popping noises. Ripper came skidding across the room, barking madly. "No!" Uncle Vernon seized one of Marge's feet and tried to pull her down again, but was almost lifted from the floor himself. A second later, Ripper leapt forward and sank his teeth into Uncle Vernon's leg. Harry tore from the dining room before anyone could stop him, heading for the cupboard under the stairs. The cupboard door burst magically open as he reached it. In seconds, he had heaved his trunk from the front door, sprinted up the stairs, threw himself under his bed, wrenching loose the floorboard, grabbed all his pillowcases and his books and birthday presents. He wriggled out sized Hedwig's empty cage and dashed out the back downstairs to the trunk. Just as Uncle Vernon burst out of the dining room, his answer, his his trouser leg in bloody tatters. "Come back in here!" he bellowed. "Come back and put her right!" But the reckless rage that had come over Harry had kicked his trunk open, pulled out his wand, pointed at Uncle Vernon. "She deserves it," he said, breathing very fast. "She deserved what she got. You keep away from me." He fumbled behind him for the latch of the door. "I'm going," Harry said. "I've had enough." In the next 2 moments, he was out in the dark, quiet street, leaving his heavy trunk behind him, Hedwig's cage under his arm.